Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The Roman ear hears this and thinks, pay the emperor his taxes. If there had been any Romans hanging about in the court of the Gentiles at the temple, they would probably have shrugged their shoulders and gone about their day. But to the Jewish ear, what would it hear? It is to be noted that Jesus begins and ends his temple teachings around money. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus starts his final week of life at the temple by turning over the tables of the money changers and calls them a den of thieves. This ignites the confrontation with the religious authorities at the temple, and they come and ask him, by what authority are you doing these things? It is at the temple that Jesus teaches about the widow. He sees her putting in her last 2 mites into the temple coffers, and he says to his disciples, beware of the scribes and Pharisees who devour widows' houses. And he also teaches about her. Truly I tell you, he says, this poor widow has put in more than anyone else, because they gave out of their abundance, but she gave everything she had, all that she had to live on. And he finishes his temple teaching this Sunday with, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The invention of money is an interesting story. In the beginning, when we didn't have money, we bartered for goods. So I'll give you a bushel of apples for a bushel of your wheat. But this became a bit cumbersome when you wanted to go and buy, for instance, toilet paper, a bag of rice, some spaghetti, and all you had were apples and they were pretty heavy. So I got to bring a bushel of apples for toilet paper, a bushel of apples for rice, and a bushel of apple for spaghetti. It became necessary to find some symbolic representation, something of value that would stand for the value of your apples. So many societies would choose a precious metal. And in Palestine, silver was chosen, and that was measured out by weight. Shekel literally means weight. But that weight and purity had to be trustworthy to actually serve as money. Minters pledged their reputation on the weight and the purity of a piece of silver by stamping on it their image, their head. Thus began the tradition of putting an image on coins. Eventually, the image that coins bore were the image of emperors or rulers. So when the pharaohs pulled out a denarius, the head of Emperor Tiberius was on it. It bore his image. The shekel was temple money. More specifically, the name of the shekel was called the Tyre shekel, which was produced up north in Palestine. During my research, I was surprised to learn that the Tyre shekel had an image on it of a pagan god. I had been under the impression that it was the money changer's job to change Roman money, which bore the head of Caesar, to acceptable non-image bearing money. What I learned instead is that because the Tyre shekel was so trusted, the religious authorities allowed for it in the temple so that the treasury would be stocked with good money. The money changers got a commission for changing Roman money to acceptable shekels. It was their exorbitant rates and the drift of their overflowing stalls into the holy places in the temple that Jesus took issue with. Not liking Jesus' teaching on money at the temple, today the Pharisees and the Herodians come to trap Jesus in treason with the question, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor? Jesus uses this moment to unveil something essential about what it means to be human. Jesus asks, "Bring me a coin used for the tax." And one of them fishes through his trousers and proffers up a denarius. Imagine what the faithful Jews around were thinking. Those who had come from all over Palestine and paid exorbitant rates to change their foreign money to temple money. There might have been a few harumphs when a denarius was produced in shekel land. Jesus then asks, whose head is on it and what title? They say, Caesar. At this point, I imagine that Jesus turned away from his questioners to the crowds and said, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." The Gentile ear would hear, "Pay your taxes." The Jewish ear would hear a riddle. The ear begins to ring with a reading from Genesis. God made humankind in God's image. It would echo with the commandment from the Decalogue. Make for thyself no graven image. Thou shalt have no gods but me. They might imagine God fashioning Adam from the dust, and then, like a minter, stamping God's image on him. They would imagine God doing this on Eve. On and on, God would stamp God's image on each human being. God would stamp the image on them. They might have concluded that since they bear God's image, they don't belong to themselves. When they heard Jesus say, "Render to God what is God's," they would need to think hard about what is being posited and what it means about who they think they are. It is reality that life is a series of capitulations that we don't always have the wherewithal to resist. The temple okayed an image of a pagan god because the tire shekel was good money. Was that wrong? They have to pay taxes to an oppressive regime that uses the money to pay the legions that polices oppression. Was that wrong? For us today, we might ask, is it okay to drive my car when our planet is warming? Or if you drive an electric car, is it okay to drive an electric car when we know that the battery means breaking down tons of rock in poor countries to produce the battery? How do you keep your hands clean and go to sleep convinced that you're a good person? One way of thinking about what Jesus is trying to do is to show us that it would be self-deception and arrogance to dice up our lives and apply a mathematics of goodness. Because we don't do such and such, and we do such and such, we are good people. And then we can judge others about what they do that is not in our math. The lie behind it is that our goodness is up to us. that we own our lives. But what Jesus is doing here is saying that our whole life belongs to God. What is good about us is God's goodness, God's image. This is what we call grace. We are in the midst of our stewardship season, and this passage from Matthew can help us contemplate what belongs to God and what belongs to us. What do we actually own? Who holds the deed to the dwelling of our soul? If I belong to God and not to myself, how am I freed to practice faith-filled generosity for the building up of this community? What would it mean to be God's currency in this world? Finally, how would you spend your life?